All right. Um, Jonas, should I record the Zoom also? No. Okay. Okay. All right. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the Uroboros Design Festival online edition, second year. I'm super excited to bring you today Andrew Hugill, who's kindly joining us to give us a super interesting talk about his most recent work. Now, before I go into that, I would like to say a few words of gratitude to our sponsors, because the festival has been supported with funds provided by the Abacus Foundation, Slovak Arts Council, and the City of Prague, and we wholeheartedly thank them for their support. Also, I would like to remind you that you are very welcome to use our Discord channel for the discussion. I will paste the link in the chat. The chat. So this is the link for the Discord channel. Of course, you are also very welcome to ask any questions or communicate in any way you want through the Zoom chat. But the Discord channel, the positive of the Discord channel is that those conversations can stay and remain for the whole duration of the festival, and even afterwards. I think we will keep it alive too. This event is part of the track of Sense Gambits, the track with works that untake things for granted and in a very Uroborian fashion, questions the sense of essence and the essence of sense. Now, it is my pleasure and an honor to introduce you to Andrew Hugill. Andrew is a founding professor of creative computing at the University of Leicester. He's a composer and a musicologist, a creative technologist, and a pataphysician who consistently works across artistic and scientific disciplines. He has founded several transdisciplinary entities in universities, most recently the Creative Computing Group in the University of Leicester. He's Principal Fellow of the Higher Education Academy and also a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. In 2012, Andrew published the wonderful book Pataphysics, A Useless Guide. And in 2016, The Digital Musician, published by Routledge and the MIT, which is now in its third edition. So today, Andrew will be presenting Parasite Logic and Pataphysical Reasoning for a Working Earth, a talk exploring how pataphysics may challenge dominant forms of reason in order to address what he calls the generalized crisis in communication that typifies the Anthropocene. So without further ado, please welcome me in welcoming Andrew Hugill. Woohoo!
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen as you do on these Zoom calls. We're getting quite good at this now, aren't we? Let's have a go. Share this. Okay, can everybody see that all right? I'm going to assume that's a yes. And you'll see that I've got captions running as well. So hopefully everybody can see those clearly. Right, so this paper, Parasite Logic and Pataphysical Reasoning for a Working Earth, this is a revised version of a multi-authored paper first published in 2020 in the Academy of Management, Learning and Education journal. And since that was intended for a rather different audience to this one, namely business and management schools, I've edited the paper to make it more suitable for this context. And it concludes with a discussion that relates directly to design and design education. There's quite a lot in here in which I'm not the greatest expert, especially that concerning the geological aspects of the Anthropocene. My contribution concerned pataphysics, and it is that which will form the core of this presentation. But I must credit my co-authors here, especially from left to right, Marta Gasparin, who was the lead author on the original paper and who's a professor of innovation and design management. Stephen Brown, a professor of social and organizational psychology. Christoph Schinkus, a professor of finance. William Green, Professor of Technology and Innovation, and then left to right on the bottom row, Simon Lilly, Professor of Information and Organisation, Martin Quinn, Professor of Regional Development and Public Policy, and then two professors of paleobiology who are among the world's leading theorists of the Anthropocene. That's Mark Williams and Jan Zelasevic. For most of the people in this group, pataphysics was a complete novelty. However, two of the authors already had some involvement with it. Marta Gasparin herself had contacted me in 2018 because of her long-standing interest in the subject, and Christoph Schinkus had published a paper on the pataphysics of finance in the journal Critical Perspectives on Accounting. King Ubu, depicted here, it will be recalled, thought much of finance, which he spelt P-H-Y-N-A-N-C-E, and he carried a crop à finance, or a finance hook, which you can just see in his pocket here. Now, this alone would have been enough to draw me into the speculation that forms the body of this presentation. However, the presence of a group of geologists within an area of critical business studies also presented an irresistibly transdisciplinary configuration of possibilities. My own specialisms are, as you've heard, music and creative computing. But I also wrote this book, Pataphysics, A Useless Guide, which has been widely read. And my involvement with pataphysics goes back to childhood. Humanity currently has an unsustainable relationship with the environment, as we all know. It is frustratingly clear that the same kind of thinking that has led to this disastrous situation is now being used to try to solve the problem. Since it is based on familiar patterns of reasoning, it merely reproduces what has gone before and so perpetuates the crisis. Our contention is that we need to disrupt current forms of reason and reasoning if we are to overcome the general crisis in communication that characterizes the Anthropocene, that geological period in which human beings have had a significant impact on the Earth's ecosystems. This paper therefore sets out how pataphysics might provide a mechanism for developing imaginary solutions to the current problem. Classically, it is the role of metaphysics to provide the tools for reorganizing our contemplation and reasoning around observable empirical phenomena, i.e. physics. However, the challenge of generating non-anthropocentric reasoning from within existing rationalities requires a pataphysical intervention. Pataphysics is a term first used in the early 1880s by a group of French schoolboys in Rennes as a way of mocking their physics teacher. One of their number, the anarchic poet, writer, and painter Alfred Jarry, 1873 to 1907, developed the science of pataphysics, first in the play Ubu Roi, which caused a massive scandal as its premiere in 1896, and subsequently in a series of surrealistic novels and other writings. Jarry declared that the actual orthography should be apostrophe pataphysics, so preceded by an apostrophe so as to avoid a simple pun. He didn't actually tell us what the pun was. But this is a spelling which wrongfoots the reader and has the effect of trying to exclude the word from the dictionary. Jarry's works, in particular Ubu, were very influential in the development of certain art movements in the 20th century, such as Dadaism, Futurism, and Surrealism. The idea of pataphysics, however, has outlived all these historical isms and has penetrated into areas far beyond the arts. Its influence may be detected today as a kind of subversive presence in almost all fields of human activity, from the natural sciences to the social sciences, from technology to the humanities. Pataphysics is the science of imaginary solutions, which symbolically attributes the properties of objects described by their virtuality to their lineaments. Pataphysics maintains a similar relationship to metaphysics as the latter has to physics. For example, in Jarry's novel Exploits and Opinions of Dr. Faustroll, Pataphysician, the titular character is introduced in the following way. Dr. Faustroll was 63 years old when he was born in Circassia in 1898. The 20th century was -2 years old. At this age, which he retained all his life, Dr. Faustroll was a man of medium height, or to be absolutely accurate, of 8 times 10 to the 10 plus 10 to the 9 plus 4 times 10 to the 8 plus 5 times 10 to the 6 atomic diameters. With a golden yellow skin, his face clean shaven, apart from a few sea green mustachios as worn by King Salah, the hairs of his head alternately platinum blonde and jet black, an auburn ambiguity changing according to the sun's position, his eyes 2 capsules of ordinary writing ink flecked with golden spermatozoa like Danzig's schnapps. At the physical level, this introduction provides a range of empirical details that appear to be derived from very different perspectives and concerns, i.e. history, atomic measurement, barbering, and drink connoisseurship. At a metaphysical level, the concern is with which of these descriptions can be said to coexist in the same world, or and those which must necessarily be excluded. E.g., was Dr. Faustroll actually 63 in 1898 or at some other point? But at a pataphysical level, we must treat all statements as equally valid, since pataphysics is the science of the particular, which deems every possible description to be an exception, and therefore subject to equivalence. We are then invited to speculatively imagine the shape of a universe supplementary to this one, or imaginary solution in which this is possible. Pataphysical solutions may appear to be absurd, but they are not irrational, being instead the outcome of immense precision in description. Note the atomic calculation of Dr. Faustroll's height and the minute specification of the drink which his eyes resemble. Pataphysics simultaneously admits the convergent thinking of rationalism and the divergent thinking of the apparently impossible to go beyond the limits of anthropocentric reason. As Lenoir observes, we represent the real according to our usage of it, or according to our very anthropomorphic perceptions of it. The lineaments could therefore be either the outline of these practices, or, which amounts to the same thing in the end, a sort of elementary structure, we know not what, of what is made manifest. All our ideation bears its mark, and no doubt always in exactly the same way, even though circumstances and indeed individuals vary. We cannot suppress these lineaments, but we can at least divert our habits and free up thinking. We must, by considering the possible ways in which we can imaginatively extend all the aspects of an object, be able to combine them to obtain a new representation of a linear something. Pataphysical freedom will be attained at the moment when we can think of objects as once as ordinary and in many other ways, being conscious only of the differences in ingenuity between these representations. This does not exclude other interpretations. One could say more simply that the pataphysician proposes to decorate with new solutions our representations of the poverty-stricken linear world. Pataphysics is at times humorous and can appear playful, but is utterly serious in its practice of imagining worlds that suspend the limits of established rationalities and forms of reasoning through a process of disruption and slowing down. Pataphysical strategies have resulted in transformative practices and inventions based on laws governing contradictions and exceptions, including non-anthropocentric reasoning. Okay, let's consider the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is characterized by a new and dangerous climate state brought about through the dominance of a single species, Homo sapiens, breaking through the photosynthetic energy barrier, the human-directed evolution of other species, and the increasing interaction of the biosphere with technology. The irreversible material consequences of the transition to a new geological reality have been clearly outlined. It is unquestionably the case that mankind has become a global geological force in its own right. However, despite the starkness of the evidence, to date there is no comprehensive, global, holistic response that might help identify the precise level of environmental danger and provide strategies to mitigate its impacts. It has been argued that this inertia arises because the Anthropocene represents such a dramatic change in human history that it is unthinkable that it defeats the rational capacity of organizations and institutions to categorize and accommodate the threats that it poses, and that it leads to the collapse of the vision of a collective human future. But the focus on the difficulty of thinking about the Anthropocene can overlook the ways in which the effects of climate change are already a brutal reality in many geographical regions, where they have intensified a plethora of local strategies for collaborative survival. We argue that the problem is best described as a generalized crisis of communication between different forms of knowledge and practice across distinct publics and interest groups, and more profoundly, between humans and the Earth system itself. The Earth system comprises the biosphere, all living organisms and their interactions with rock, soil, air, and water; hydrosphere, all the waters on the Earth; atmosphere, the set of gases surrounding the Earth; and lithosphere, the rocky outer part of the Earth. Its individual components are intimately interconnected and co-evolve, so that the change in the utilization of materials from the land will have concomitant effects on all the other components of the system, as with the burning of fossil fuels stored within the lithosphere, which when liberated alter the atmosphere, hydrosphere, and biosphere. The resources of the different components of the Earth system are all finite, so that overutilization of its component parts also has a concomitant effect on other components. For example, the use of nitrogen fertilizers, which impact strongly and negatively on aquatic ecosystems into which they drain. To provide lasting, mutualistic, and sustainable solutions to the Earth's environmental problems requires an understanding of this Earth system complexity, and it needs human systems to evolve to allow non-human actors to be active subjects of the conversation. This clearly requires interdisciplinary work, accompanied by a wholesale rethinking of current forms of social and economic organizing. It's no longer possible to conceive of doing business as usual in even the immediate future, although business as usual often remains unchallenged in business and management research. The coronavirus pandemic is an example of how the Earth system shows that there are multiple intersecting forms of value creation of human and non-human actors. The business as usual concept needs to be challenged, and the relation between different organisms taken into account, as the ongoing spread of the current mutation of the coronavirus has demonstrated in relation to rapidly emerging transformations in social, economic, and political relations. A potentially far-reaching issue is the way in which communication is conceptualized in relation to interdisciplinarity. As French philosopher Michel Serres has observed, there is a persistent tendency to see communication as a matter of control and exchange for instrumental purposes. He writes with Bruno Latour, "Have you noticed the popularity among scientists of the word interface, which supposes that the junction between two sciences or two concepts is perfectly under control? On the contrary, I believe that these spaces between are more complicated than one thinks. This is why I've compared them to the Northwest Passage, with shores, island, and fractal ice flows, less a juncture under control than an adventure to be had." The received understanding of interdisciplinarity posits a neutral relationship between two bodies of knowledge, between which information is exchanged, where the clarity with which the messages sent from one to the other are received is central. But Serres points to the lack of concern for what happens to messages in the communicative space between sender and receiver, where information may be distorted, deferred, transformed, translated, or simply lost. When communication is treated as an entirely rational process of information exchange in a controlled medium, the critical role of middle space is ignored. This claim can be extended to the broader webs of communication around the Anthropocene, where it is assumed that bringing stakeholders into a reasoned conversation around climate change will produce desired outcomes if the evidence can be clearly transmitted and received without distortion. Even communication with non-human actors within the Earth system can be treated in the same way, under the rubric of listening to nature. These are all instances of an anthropocentric model of communication fashioned on classical notions of unmediated dialogue between speakers and listeners who exercise mastery over the communicative space. What we are calling a generalized crisis of communication arises from the failure of the anthropocentric model to describe the complex middle space in which a whole host of other parties and actors enter into and shape any given communicative act. In the same way that any interdisciplinary exchange necessarily includes a range of concepts, instruments, institutional structures, and funding regimes, efforts to dialogue with the Earth system pass by way of innumerable biospheric, atmospheric, technological, and multi-species actors. It is not simply a question of including these missing masses, because human communication around the Anthropocene already depends on their presence. There is no rational speech situation outside the biospheric conditions which make it possible. Nor is it a matter of just hearing the voices of the absent elements of the Earth system, because this would involve subordinating the middle space to existing forms of human-defined reason. What is instead required is a non-anthropocentric approach to communication that is able to show how the middle or third space is both critical to and disruptive of our efforts to engage with climate change. Michel Serres' concept of parasitism provides just such an approach. Serres conceives all forms of communication through a triadic structure where the signal that passes from sender to receiver encounters disruptive forces, or noise, as he calls it. This results in a dynamic shifting of positions as the intervening forces, which Serres personalizes as the parasite, struggle with the communicative pair to intercept and redirect the signal. Because a signal is fundamentally defined in relation to noise, the parasite can be seen as the very conditions of communication, and that which perpetually threatens its existence. While Serres treats parasitism as a process at work within all organic life, humans are increasingly a special case. Recent human history has been defined by global technological developments that have resulted in humans, as one group of hominids, departing from the evolutionary rhythms of other species, a process Serres terms hominescence. The unconstrained expansion of the technosphere renders humans as literally the biggest parasites on the planet, and figuratively, through the globalization of communication circuits, as the most parasitized of all species. The great acceleration of population, industrialization, and globalization that started in the mid-20th century was the pathway to the current generalized crisis of communication. Serres argues that we cannot reverse this great acceleration. To do so is no longer within human power, but we can act to slow it down or to turn it back on itself by engaging with the planetary interdependencies through which it was constituted. This engagement cannot be conducted through the application of established modes of instrumental reason, which impose human-derived categories, but must seek emergent speculative forms of reasoning. We propose that a range of strategies be adopted that enable the suspension or productive disruption of rationality in order to create the space for relationally derived reasoning. The origins of classical reason lie in the logical principle of the excluded middle. It is necessarily the case that a given proposition is either true or its negation is true. It cannot be the case that both are true. This creates two distinct logical positions by removing the possibility of a middle or shared ground. From this principle, the modern notions of identity, difference, subject, and object that constitute the grammar of rational action are derived, including digital technology, which relies on Boolean logic. A lot of time and energy is being spent disambiguating for the benefit of computers, when ambiguity is the condition of nature. Serres argues that the structure of communication demonstrates a paradox in the principle. For two subjects to communicate, they require a third element, the medium through which to transmit a signal. However, as we have previously described, this immediately introduces noise, a third partner, which is simultaneously the condition of possibility of the communicative relation and that which acts to perpetually disrupt and destabilize it. Noise oscillates between inclusion and exclusion. Pataphysics is a science which continuously embraces, indeed derives energy from, the simultaneous coexistence of mutually exclusive opposites. It calls this condition the plus-minus, and the pataphysical symbol of the spiral depicts the resulting energy, infinitely developing while describing both the spiral that is drawn and the spiral that is delineated by the spiral that is drawn. Our argument is for the need to shift from anthropocentric rationalities through a slowing down and disruption of parasitic relations to reopen communication with the excluded third space. Pataphysics provides a means to do this through subjecting dominant modes of rationality to a divergent thinking of the absurd and proposing playful forms of reasoning. Today's predominant mode is mostly driven by convergent thinking, whereas divergent thinking is typically dismissed as irrelevant, counterproductive, or foolish. Divergent thinking comprises multiple spontaneous, non-linear, and free-flowing outcomes from an initial stimulus, adding up to a healthy diversity in reasoning and suggesting a healthy neurodiversity. Divergent thinking belies the extent to which, as a mode of thought, it depends upon the rigorous application of structure and procedures, often derived from formal mathematics. In this sense, pataphysics does not correspond to the kind of illogical thinking that Vince describes as arising from the structuring and unsettling effects of unconscious dynamics, as it is logical in its approach. This is particularly apparent, for example, in the work of Georges Perec, whose 1969 novel La Disparition is written entirely without the letter E. This meticulous application of an arbitrary writing constraint forces the production of an innovative text where there can be no easy recourse to existing idioms. At one level, pataphysics could be understood as being akin to an injunction to continuously think outside the box. Pataphysical logic often follows a three-step process modeled on Jarry's physics to metaphysics to pataphysics sequence. A typical example from Georges Perec runs as follows. If physics proposes you have a brother and he likes cheese, then metaphysics replies, if you have a brother, he likes cheese. But pataphysics says you don't have a brother and he likes cheese. Perec's example plays with the syllogistic form to offer three linked propositions. Our understanding of the form leads us to expect that the final concluding proposition will provide a logical thread by making use of the excluded middle, an either-or specification of the relationship between the two parts of the major and minor propositions, brother and cheese. But the conclusion takes the form both and, which affirms all possible states of the prior relationship. The coexistence of opposites, along with the equivalence of all judgments, is a core aspect of pataphysics. Pataphysics insists that we imagine the world where this is possible. Pataphysics anticipated Whitehead's critique of the bifurcation of nature through its deliberate according of agency to non-human entities. Jarry himself lived with a pair of owls and a chameleon, and his posthumously published novel, Exploits and Opinions of Dr. Felstroll, Pataphysician, includes the central character of a dog-faced baboon, Bostonage, who provides comments, ripostes, critiques, and reactions to narrative events through a repeated dissyllable, ha ha. The venerable Collège de Pataphysique, which began in Paris immediately after World War II, included among its founders a Mata turtle, which is depicted on the bottom left of the slide there. Another early member was Lutembi, a crocodile living in Lake Victoria, who dispensed justice by devouring the guilty or sparing the innocent. Lutembi became the fourth vice-curator of the Collège de Pataphysique, the highest-ranking living creature after the fictional creator, Dr. Faustroll. The president of the Netherlands Academy of Pataphysics, the NAP, or NAP, whose members have themselves made significant contributions to environmental actions, is Vudagemal, the largest steam pumping engine in the world. You can just see the building on the bottom right there. This machine was elected president because the Netherlands is a superprosthesis, a hydraulic system of ditches, locks, dikes, and dams, a gigantic imaginary solution. There are pataphysical organizations in most countries in the world today. Some of them consist of a single individual, sometimes with multiple identities, and others have hundreds of members, both human and non-human. Their organograms invariably reflect the exceptional and contradictory nature of pataphysics itself. The Collège de Pataphysique, which has very many adherents worldwide, is structured ironically like a cross between a university and the Catholic Church. Jarry's twin targets were science and religion. Most pataphysical organizations use the pataphysical calendar, depicted here, which starts from the birth of Jarry and has 13 equal months, each consisting of 29 days. One of these is an imaginary day that can be inserted at will. Pataphysics makes use of a series of conceptual practical operators, including plus minus, as I mentioned, the simultaneous coexistence of mutually exclusive opposites, clinamen, which is a small swerve or deviation within a predictable field, syzygy, the surprising encounter of apparently unrelated entities, and anomaly, the exceptional contradiction, the thing that does not fit. Although pataphysics in itself is not designed to be useful, it does promote a different way of thinking that subverts more familiar and rational processes with real-world applications, proposing playful forms of reasoning. Jarry makes this point about a watch. Why should anyone claim that the shape of a watch is round? A manifestly false proposition, since it appears in profile as a narrow rectangular construction, elliptic on three sides. And why the devil should one only have noticed its shape at the moment of looking at the time? If an object is divorced from its supposed function, one can start to notice other things about it. The poet and Christian scientist Christian Burke describes the pataphysical clinamen as the smallest possible aberration that can make the greatest possible difference. For example, in 1914, the pataphysician Marcel Duchamp began creating ready-mades, which involved making slight alterations to ordinary manufactured objects. These led directly to the formation of a completely new art market and had a massive influence on marketing, advertising, and even manufacturing. The key point here is that global changes could be initiated by ramifying and articulating small, unpredictable events that arise locally, creating not only new relationships among things, but also proposing a new form of respect for things in themselves. Duchamp's approach to aesthetics is relational. The ready-made is a kind of rendezvous during which the concept of an a priori object is manifesting in front of the artist. It shows itself, and in this process declares itself as art. The artist recognizes it, accepts it, and he or she inscribes the date, hour, minute, and the title of the ready-made as information, declaring this is art. In this perspective, objects and authors are nothing but the conditions of their encounter. The artist, by not providing a fine art commodity, but a mundane object, turns out to be a manufacturer. Scandalously, Duchamp's once utilitarian object proves capable of going further and becoming art. Syzygy is an astronomical term that refers to the alignment of 3 or more bodies. In pataphysics, this gives rise metaphorically to the aha or even ah moment, at which the connection between apparently unrelated things is recognized. This demonstrates the sense of the deeply serious nature of the playfulness crucial to pataphysics. Although the selection of objects to compare can appear random or downright bizarre, e.g. picked from a box at home or a random backpack, it is only through allowing the creative freedom to invent new and unexpected forms of relations that it becomes possible for conceptually or geographically remote objects to be linked together. In physics, constellations provide one example of such linkage, and quantum entanglement another. Pataphysics proposes a reversal in the way that normativity and exceptionalism is considered. For pataphysicians, every phenomenon, including the laws of nature themselves, is an anomaly. There is no general state from which they depart. Things are characterized by the way they do not fit, rather than by their common features. Here, the limits to human ingenuity and failure reveal the anomalous nature of things. Humans regard the misguided and the failed as unwelcome in a societal system that is geared towards success. However, success can retrospectively appear as a gigantic failure. Pataphysics reflects on failures and produces creative solutions. From a pataphysical perspective, failure is intrinsically as interesting as success. In 2017, the artist Isabelle Desjeux installed a pataphysical lab at the Art Science Museum in Singapore. Visitors were provided with a Lego building station, a photography station, and a bean counting station, and advised that they were going to fail. The failed attempts were exhibited, but not before important discussions were had about the prospect of failure. Desjeux has elaborated this kind of thinking into a scientific study of failomics. It's crucial to recognize that for Jarry, pataphysics is a science. Indeed, as he puts it in Faustroll, it is the science. The rigorously imaginary approach of pataphysics has shown itself to have relevance for science and technological development. For example, pataphysical techniques may be seen at work in a number of pivotal events in the history of conventional science. Since 1952, the American Miscellaneous Society has presented an annual award of a stuffed albatross for pataphysical feats such as finding a way to observe the ocean without going to sea. That was awarded to Paul Scully Power in 1987. He was a trained oceanographer who flew on the 6th flight of the Space Shuttle Challenger. Or for unique and non-conventional ideas concerning the oceans, awarded to the oceanographer John Isaacs in 1980, which included ideas such as extracting energy from ocean salinity gradients to provide Los Angeles with fresh water from icebergs towed up the Pacific from Antarctica. One real-world outcome of all this was Project Mohole, the science fictionist idea to drill through the ocean floor into the Earth's mantle, that part of the Earth's rocky interior that lies below the crust. This actually took place in 1961. And although it was technically a failure, they got nowhere near the mantle, it did show that deep ocean drilling was possible. And out of that emerged the Deep Sea Drilling Project, later the Ocean Drilling Program, which is arguably the most important, expensively funded and revolutionary Earth sciences program of the second half of the 20th century. Parasite logic and pataphysical reasoning can be brought together to explore new modes of organizing in the Anthropocene. Numerous examples might be used, including permaculture initiatives, alternative food networks. All share a commitment to slowing down parasitic relations to focus on communication with non-human actors within the excluded third space through imaginative solutions. These practices may be tiny clinamen or swerves within the global economy, but they are potentially deviations with significant consequences. Slow design-driven innovation is a key example here, because it is explicit in its aim of encouraging humans to acknowledge and confront their dependency on the Earth system and vice versa. Strauss and Farluc depicts slow design as an approach predicated on slowing the metabolism of people, resources, and flows, which could provide a design paradigm that would engender positive behavioral change. Slow design first evolved in Italy as an approach to making high-value goods that produce sustainable livelihoods. Key to this was fostering the use of renewable and, where possible, local sources of energy, material, and designing products that could be returned to nature at the end of their functional lives. Slow design-driven innovation is an emerging movement in fashion and design that recognizes the importance of taking the time to produce. This does not necessarily refer to the actual production process itself, which can be variable, but rather in the configuration of natural resources that are used. Through this approach, slow designers embrace the idea of increasing rather than decreasing their dependence on the natural resources they engage with, slowing down the design processes to continuously reflect upon the character of this dependency, and thinking about the multiple effects they can have on the evolving environmental context of the Anthropocene. This can be described as the building in of environmental resilience within an economic model, to borrow a term from biodiversity literature. Slow design-driven innovation does not observe the usual timings of markets and their rapid cycles of parasitic activity. Instead, production times are tied to the natural cycles of the raw materials, respecting their own timings rather than seeking to accelerate them through artificial measures. Slow designers work closely with local craft makers to mobilize creativity in design processes that reflect upon local identity, understand what constitutes local heritage, and envisage how these could be embedded in the shape of contemporary-looking products using traditional technology. This typically involves recourse to long-standing soft technologies of communal artisanal production in close proximity with resources, rather than the hard technologies or firepower of industrial-scale production. This focus on soft technologies gives slow design-driven innovation a different relationship to the past and the future of Anthropocenic human history. A slow design approach involves thinking about the afterlife of the product. The energy is not only sourced locally, but is also given back to the environment. This works towards imaginary solutions framed in terms of the wider growth of the biosphere. For example, some designers have created garments that can be buried in the garden once a customer wishes to dispose of them to make compost for plants. This is a pleasing syzygy, a buried garment rotting into compost that gives rise to an aha moment of accomplishing small-scale sustainability. This is in contrast to the approaches that operate with a mindset oriented towards design for globalized fashion markets, where there may be a concern with using initially recycled materials, but the methods of disposing of the garments are not factored in. A slow design approach also includes a reduction in air and shipping travel, which reduces the environmental impact of global commerce. Looking at this slide to conclude, as Mark Williams points out, 500 million years ago, this worm lived on the seabed of southern China. At death, it was trapped in sediment and immaculately preserved. The black line running down the middle of the animal shows the gut. About 5 centimeters long from tip to tip, the worm was likely a predator, but perhaps hunter became hunted, as this worm is colonized by several tiny worms. Are these tiny worms hitching a ride? Or is the relationship sinister? Perhaps the tiny worms are parasites. Whatever you decide, the fossil shows the ancient and precious roots of Earth's complex ocean ecosystems. Converting problem-solving tasks from an either-or to a both-and format, thereby emphasizing the plus-minus, creates a situation where not only is there no right or wrong answer, but there is also no obvious criterion for success. Everything is failure. And as a pataphysical consequence, everything is equally interesting and worthy of debate. Newark identifies the logic of absurdity as a potential option for leaders that may create anomalous and outstanding decisions. Following the pataphysical notion that everything is an anomaly, we recommend a rigorous absurdity as the default mode of reasoning. Absurdity is a powerful tool for relentlessly pursuing a series of propositions at escalating levels of implausibility. But it is also a device for demonstrating how the scaling up of apparently rational solutions can lead to the utterly irrational. For example, industrial farmed or broiler chickens are the world's most numerous birds, with a standing population of 22.7 billion. Since the mid-20th century, broiler growth rates have soared, and the chickens have up to a 5-fold increase in individual biomass and are incapable of surviving on their own. These birds have been modified by humans to have more meat on them, to the point that they need to be killed young. They have a maximum 7-week lifespan. Beyond this, the modern broiler would grow with a wide body shape, a low center of gravity, and multiple osteopathologies, reduced pelvic muscles, and decreased size of lungs and heart. It would not survive to maturity. We need to teach design students through playful learning that every idea needs to be subjected to a rigorous conceptual absurdity before it becomes an empirical manifestation of human disgust and anthropocenic tragedy. The techniques pataphysics offers upend the classical reasoning of the excluded middle in a similar way to parasite logic. However, it will be a mistake to reduce pataphysics to a mere set of techniques. Indeed, the Collège de Pataphysique tried for many years to have itself officially declared a public inutility, the quality of having no practical use. The espoused uselessness of pataphysics again serves to disarm the instrumentality of reasoning, forcing us to stay with the imaginary solution and puzzle upon its both-and structure. Much of what we teach in design schools is framed using forms of reason that are entirely anthropocentric. That is, in terms of human desires, needs, intentions, and so forth. But this framing of problems is being systematically undermined from 2 different directions. If Haff is correct in his assertion that the technosphere has a kind of aggregate autonomy that eludes human mastery, then we must inquire as to what it wants and where it is going. Equally, we need to know how other organisms in the Earth system are responding to climate change and the directions of travel that they are moving toward. Our limited human-centric conceptions of agency are a real obstacle here. We must learn what design looks like for a tadpole. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Andrew. That was a really, really nice, really interesting talk. I think we have some time for questions, and I see that in the chat, Anne, you have posted one question, but I was wondering maybe you would like to ask it directly yourself.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. I can certainly give it a go. I was just loving this because it's just
Right.
really excitingly conceptualizing ways that I think a number of us are feeling towards doing things that are counterintuitive deliberately and that sort of thing. So it's really lovely to hear it much more clearly articulated and with so many literary references. And as I've thrown into the chat, I've been a great fan of Jarry for many years. I've just never put these worlds together. It's so great. But I find that in my thinking about the anthropocentric, and I've been talking about the idea of anthropocentric functionalism as a way of trying to look at what is problematic in design and perhaps find a way beyond it, but aligning much more with feminist technoscience. So, thinkers like Donna Haraway and Anna Tsing and others, and perhaps using concepts of care, which tend to come from a very different kind of analysis and perhaps more about feeling than different rationalities of thinking or unthinking. And I just wondered if you could comment on those relations a little, because they seem to be taking completely different parts of the issue, but I'm wondering if you see connections.
Um, the short answer, the short answer is yes. I see connections. I think there are connections. I think in terms of Jarry, I mean, we have to sort of separate out the historical from the present day here a bit. In terms of Jarry, I think we have to be careful because there's a difference, I think, between the kind of logic of pataphysics and what you might call an irrational state, you know, a kind of unthinking state. Jarry was supremely intellectual, and I think pataphysics is quite an intellectualized conception. I know people like Artaud, for example, tried to tap into what they saw as Jarry's instinctually driven approach, you know, making your life into a work of art and so on. But I think Artaud and Jarry aren't quite the same in that respect, and I suspect. Were Jarry around today, he would perhaps be somewhat resistant to the connection that you've described. However, pataphysics isn't Jarry. Jarry was, I mean, Jarry himself recognized this to his credit. He said that he merely revealed pataphysics to the world and identified an idea that then had, you know, many more possibilities than he could envisage. In fact, he said that Faustroll is a book that wouldn't be understood in his lifetime. So I think if we extend pataphysics into the present day, then I think we're perfectly at liberty to make these connections. And I do think there is a link. And in fact, there is, I don't know whether you're aware of it, but there is a feminist laboratory of pataphysics in Canada. I don't know whether you've heard of this one, but they do work that's very much in this area, actually. I'll send you the details. So they do kind of interventions, I suppose you describe them. They're a bit like art actions, but they're not quite art actions. But very much in line with this kind of Haraway feminist technoscience sort of thinking. So sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but I think I'm perceiving connections, and it would be fascinating to try and explore those more.
Thank you. I mean, I think for me, one of the things is that both initiatives are trying to work within a system that we can't step outside and recognize that in different ways, and then try and draw attention to those ironies and then kind of occupy it, but in really different ways. So my head is slightly blown now as I try and reconcile these different kinds of thinking. So in a sense, I was trying to get you to do my intellectual work for me here, but thank you for some really interesting crossovers with the kind of way that I'm feeling like design is able to tolerate. Sorry, maybe I'm taking up too much time, but
go for it.
Design is able to tolerate multiple inconsistent systems, and science isn't. And for me, that is why design is so interesting at the moment, because it allows us to say something needs to be fit for purpose rather than true. And this is, a different orientation in that you've just been elaborating on, in a sense.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think what happens in science, well, particularly computer science, which is the bit of science that I know best, I guess. I mean, if you look at the history of the web, for example, there was a period early on where there was very much that kind of freewheeling open approach. And then I think as commercial interests largely take over, what they call the neats come in and tidy everything up and stop there being any of this fit for purpose stuff. I mean, it's happening right now with quantum computing, which I think is pataphysics. I mean, it's basically is pataphysics. The quantum computer, the central processor is held at a temperature that is just, very, very fractionally above absolute zero. It's probably the coldest place on Earth. Is the central processor of a quantum computer. And this sounds very much like Jarry's idea of about duration, where he owed quite a lot to Bergson, but he kind of has his own take on it. And the frozen the time travel and the frozen state. And of course, what's happening with quantum computing, and I don't know whether any of you have ever tried to program the quantum computer. You can do it if you go to the IBM website. You can actually program a quantum computer. It's a bit like writing music. It's on a 5-line state. But what's happening at the moment with quantum computing is that nobody really knows what they're doing. Nobody really knows even if they've actually created a quantum computer. So there's a lot of kind of speculative work that is really imaginative going on. But also what's happening ominously is the crowds are gathering as they see the potential of a commercial development here. And as they do so, the forces of neatness are coming in and tidying everything up and making it all logical and scientific, And so I think our job is to slow that process down and resist this endless drive towards rationalism that is so destructive of creativity. And I think this applies in science as much as design.
Here, here. And of course, they are designing the quantum computer at the moment. So it hasn't become science yet, in a sense. But,
exactly.
No, we've got this kind of amazing kind of rock and roll type headbanger doing it at Sussex, and it's just brilliant to watch. But yeah, I mean, I'm definitely a spectator. Anyway, so anybody else would like to take over?
I'd like to talk more about feminist technoscience at some point, but anyway, not now. Yeah.
So does anyone else want to ask a question? Would like to ask a question? I know we have here in the audience Soren and Isabella, which are very proficient in pataphysics and design. Maybe you have something to add. Sorry for putting you in the spotlight, but it's such a good opportunity. Or maybe I can just ask another question. So perhaps the question I wanted to ask is related to the idea of communication that you mentioned, the idea of a crisis in the communication and how to build these new pathways of that kind of take into account the middle, right? And I wanted to ask you the question through your own personal experience of publishing such a multidisciplinary paper together with your authors. How was that process? How did you come together? And maybe I could even ask you, using one of my favorite formulas from the paper, did you manage to have any process for rigorously structured absurdity going on in the process?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. And I think, having done many transdisciplinary projects over the years, what you learn is that each one has its own character and depends very much on the individuals involved. Whatever we think about disciplines, we tend to have this notion of disciplines as these kind of perfectly formed things. But of course, actually it's just people, and people get along or people don't get along. So what happened with this one was that Marta tried to put together a group of people, and she called it the Anthropocene Research Group, and she invited me to join. I have to say I wasn't terribly interested in at that time in the idea of the Anthropocene or researching it, and this seemed to be mainly about geology. Then it emerged it was also about critical management and management studies and business. So I sort of thought, well, that's an odd combination. And then I went along to a meeting and kind of sat there biting my lip for most of the meeting, because I thought, well, I don't think really pataphysics has anything to do with this. I don't see where it fits. And as soon as I start talking about it, they're going to go, oh, don't be ridiculous. This isn't proper science, this. And I was very nervous, actually, about even raising this idea. But eventually, with some encouragement from Marta, I did. And to my amazement, when I did, the real scientists in the group, the geologists and professors of paleobiology and business science and cognitive psychologists and all this, all got completely fascinated by it and said, and just totally embraced it. And so the result was I ended up having more and more meetings where I talked more and more and they listened more and more. I was always kind of a bit reluctant to do it in a way, because I know what can happen with pataphysics. Once you go down that plug hole and you go down the spiral into the, you never stop. And I'm always a bit kind of wary of that. And I was also nervous about being ridiculed by colleagues, which has happened on many occasions. But this group happily did not ridicule me, and in fact went out of their way to find points of connection. So, I mean, those stories that I told about the Stuffed Albatross Award, that came from the geologists, and they said, well, hang on a minute, we've got pataphysics in geology too, Have you ever heard of this miscellaneous society? I said, no, I have no idea what that is, and then it turns out these really are pataphysical ideas. I mean, they remind me a lot of Raymond Roussel or Jules Verne or something like that. It's just, let's bore a hole through the center of the earth, that kind of thing. So I was immediately attracted to it. I mean, the Stuffed Albatross Award, the albatross has certain associations these days, but obviously at the time with Monty Python and so on. But these days they didn't make that connection, So yeah, so that was how it went. And then the second part of I've forgotten the second part of your question. Can you remind me again, Enrique? Sorry.
The rigorously structured absurdity.
Rigorously structured absurdity. Well, I think every aspect of the paper that I've just read was an example of that, because what we had to do was try and feed these ideas. So we had Michel Serres, we had geology, and we had pataphysics, and making the connection between the three involved applying absurdity to each idea. So, I mean, I like Michel Serres' philosophy, but I also did subject it to some absurdity. I mean, this all came to a head because we had Bruno Latour came and we went out to dinner with him. He gave a paper, and we all went. So the Anthropocene research group sat in a curry house in Leicester with Bruno Latour, which was quite an amusing event. And certainly there was a lot of rigorously conducted absurdity during that conversation, I can tell you. Probably helped by several pints of beer.
Super interesting. Yeah, I'm afraid the event was 1 hour and we are already running out of time. So unless anyone else has any more questions, I mean, we can keep in the chat in the Discord and everything, but for now we would. So thank you.
I'll just say thank you, and that
yeah.
It would be great to talk more about these intersections, perhaps. Yeah.
Yes, please send me an email, and we can continue the conversation.
Yeah, great. Cheers. Well, thanks. That was super.
You're very welcome.
Yes, thank you very much.
Pataphysical consciousness. I like that, Isabella Brandelis.
Yes.
Happy to talk to anybody. Send me an email. I'm very happy to talk if people want to talk. Yeah.
Fantastic.